Good evening, and welcome everyone to Immigration Today, which will feature attorney and Marquette University Law School Associate Professor Ed Fallone, who will be talking about the nuts and bolts of immigration and answer your questions, immigration law. My name is Denise Lindberg, and I'm a member of the Planning Committee for TOSA's All-City READ, an initiative of the Wauwatosa Neighborhood Association Council. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Masterpiece sponsor, Beth Jaworski of Shore West Realtors, and bestseller sponsor, North Shore Bank, for making this event possible. Just a little bit about our format. This is a Zoom webinar, which is a little different than the Zoom meetings you might have joined in the past. You can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. If you have questions during the presentation, please click the Q&A near the bottom of your window and type in your question. I'll pose the audience questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties at any point during the presentation, leave the presentation and close Zoom. Then you'd reopen this webinar with the same login link that you received by email or on Facebook. Finally, this presentation will be recorded so you can re-watch it if you missed anything or want to share it with others. The link will be available on our Facebook page, the TOSA All-City READ Facebook page. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ed Fallone, who is currently, as I said, an associate professor of law at Marquette University Law School, where he has been a member of the faculty since 1992. His primary areas of teaching and scholarship include constitutional law, corporate law, immigration law, and white-collar crime. After completing undergraduate and law school at Boston University, he took a position as an associate at the law firm of Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, where he was between 1988 and 1992, and then came to Marquette University in 1992 to be on the faculty. He also practiced law as of counsel at the Milwaukee office of Gonzalez, Sayo, and Harlan from 2005 to 2013. He has served on a host of community boards here in Milwaukee as a volunteer. He is currently a member of the Undocumented Students Task Force at Marquette University. And in 2020, he was co-chair of the Wisconsin Todos con Biden Committee, which performed Latino voter outreach for the Biden for President campaign. Professor Fallone, when you were running for Wisconsin State Supreme Court, you shared a story about your family at an event that I attended, which really seemed to have shaped the way you've lived your life. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of immigration law, would you mind sharing that before your presentation? I found it a very moving story.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you, Maureen, and TOSA's All-City READ, and everyone watching. It's a pleasure to be with you as you discuss your book. Immigration law is about family, and I was always happy to share stories of my family and how they came to the United States. My father was the grandson of Italian immigrants who came to the Pittsburgh area to work in the steel mills. And he was the first in his family to go to college, and it was the Indiana State Teachers College, which was, of course, in Pennsylvania. Go figure. I think it's now Indiana University of Pennsylvania, as I think what it's called. And so he was a college student, and one of his buddies and him got the idea that they would go to Mexico City to take some classes over the summer. And so they went to Mexico City. And while they were there taking classes, his buddy started dating a Mexican girl and came up to my father one day and said, "Hey, would you like to go to a party? I've heard about this party." My girlfriend told me. My father was always happy to go to a party. He said, "Yeah." And his friend said, "Well, there's just one catch. Well, my girlfriend and I will meet you there. We have to be somewhere else first. And so he told my father directions how to navigate Mexico City. Even then, we're talking about the late 1950s. It's a booming metropolis even then. And so he got instructions how to take the streetcar, how to take the bus, how to navigate to find the location of this party on the other side of the city. And he managed to find his way there. And it's amazing to me. Every time I tell this story, I'm amazed because my father never learned a word of Spanish, really. So how he found this party is beyond me. And he got there fully expecting his friend and his friend's girlfriend to meet him there. And of course, after he gets there, they're not there. He's on his own. And so he's traveled across the city to an unknown location where he knows no one and he doesn't speak Spanish. And he decides, well, I'm just going to knock on the door. And he knocks on the door, and my mother opened the door. It was her birthday party that he had been invited to. And so she invited him in, and fortunately, she spoke English. And they talked, and they danced, and they had a wonderful time. And they began seeing each other. And when my father returned to the United States to finish his college career, they wrote letters back and forth every day. And then a year later to the day, on my mother's birthday, they were married in Mexico City. And then he took his bride back to the United States, back to Pennsylvania for a year. And eventually they made their way to the state of Maryland, where they raised 4 children. And I was the second child. Family, right? Story, all of our families, everyone watching this webinar has a family story, a family history. Related to immigration, how their grandparents or great-grandparents came to the United States for the first time. There's another family story I like to tell about immigration. After I married my wife, Heidi, we were having dinner with her father. And her father made a point of saying, the biggest mistake I ever made was sending my daughter to a big East Coast university where she fell in with the wrong crowd. And I'm sitting there and I met Heidi at East Coast University. Obviously, he was referring to me. That was the biggest mistake. And, you know, I think immigration is like family. In your family, you worry about who's going to join the family, who's going to marry your kid, right? I have a daughter. I have a son, but certainly with my daughter, and she's in her 20s, you know, you think about, who is she going to bring home? Is this going to, she going to bring home a boy who's of the same religion as we are? Is she going to bring home a boy who's of the same socioeconomic group as we are, the same educational level? It's 2021, so you know, I even think, is she going to bring home a girl, right? I mean, and it's not in my control. I have no power over who's going to become a member of my family. And I think immigration is similar to family, because you know, oftentimes we feel we have no power, we have no say in what happens to our country and who the new members are, and we're scared and we worry. You know, are these new members of our national family, are they going to assimilate? Are they people that we will understand and share values with, or are they going to be very different? I think that's why the immigration debate is so emotional sometimes, and why it seems we have so much difficulty as a country resolving it and coming to consensus. What kind of people do we want? And ultimately, I keep coming back to, we don't have power over it. We can do all we can to try to build walls or to make laws, but ultimately, I think it's out of our control, much like my father-in-law couldn't stop his daughter from marrying me and joining the family. So let me talk about our current immigration law in the United States. You know, who are the people that we have decided that we want to allow to come to our country through legal channels, right? We've made that decision through a law dating back to the 1960s, it sort of makes decisions as to the kinds of people around the world who we want to allow to come to the U.S. and eventually stay here permanently, whether they stay as a permanent resident alien or whether they become a citizen. I'm going to attempt to share a screen, and I don't know if it's going to work. We will see. And if it doesn't work, that's fine. I'm fully capable of continuing to talk and being somewhat entertaining. So let's see if this works. Denise, are you seeing anything?
I'm not.
I think it's not working. So I'll just be descriptive. It's all right. It's not much of a document anyway. I'm just going to describe the U.S. legal immigration system as set forth by Congress under current law. There are 4 categories of individuals that Congress has decided can come to the United States under legal channels and stay here permanently. And the first category is close relatives of U.S. citizens and, in some instances, permanent resident aliens who are already here in the U.S. Close relatives. And, when I say close relatives, I'm not talking about cousins, aunts, or uncles. I'm talking about really close relatives. And so the immediate relatives of a U.S. citizen are defined as a spouse or a minor child or a parent. Your spouse, your child, or your parent. And that's the bulk of the visas every year available for family-based immigration. Again, we're not talking aunts, uncles, we're not talking cousins, we're talking your spouse, your kid, your parent. Then there's a series of visas that might be available for the adult children of U.S. citizens if they're unmarried. So the bulk of the visas go to your immediate family, but your adult children who are unmarried, so they're over the age of 21, they're not married, they can ask for a visa and they can be brought over. There are fewer visas every year available in that category. Then the spouse or child of a permanent resident. And then there's some visas available for married children of U.S. citizens. And then finally, brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens. And as you go down that list, most of the visas are available for immediate relatives, and then adult children who are unmarried, and then adult children who are married, and then brothers and sisters. And there's about 480,000 visas each year, 480,000 each year, that are available for family-based immigration. I should say that there are far more people who apply for these visas than the 480,000. And so what happens is that if you apply and all the allotment for the year has been taken up already, you just get in line. And then the next year, you're in line for one of those visas. But it's not that simple because the line has been building for a long time. It's sort of like Packers season tickets. And so actually, there's a many year waiting list. Not so much for the immediate relatives, but by the time you get down to a brother or sister of a US citizen, you could be talking 10 or 20 years to wait before a visa becomes available. There are just limited supply every year. Demand far exceeds the supply. People wait in line for the next available one, and it may be the line is so long, it's 10 or 20 years before that's available. The other thing is that we cap the number of visas from certain countries or from every country. We don't want to have Mexico use up all the family-based visas. And so we say Mexico gets a certain maximum, and India gets a certain maximum, and the Philippines and China. So every nation gets a certain maximum number. And what that means is that we reach the maximum every year, and the backlog gets longer. And especially if you're the brother or sister of a US citizen, and you're in the Philippines or Mexico or a country of really high demand, you really are looking at a 30-year wait before you can immigrate to the US legally. So 480,000 visas a year. Many of these people have been waiting for decades to get these visas. Again, if it's an immediate spouse, minor child, or parent, that happens more quickly. That's the first category. And that's really the bulk of our legal immigration. It's the principle is family reunification. Let's keep families together. That's the theme of this evening. The second category of legal immigration is employment-based. And 140,000 visas are available each year. And when you talk about employment-based, there's a certain category of very key, desirable business-based people that the US wants. And the very top category is internationally recognized professionals in the science or the arts. And these, it's supposed to be like Nobel Prize winners or Oscar-winning actors or actresses. It's supposed to be people who are internationally recognized at the very top of the field. Now, this happens to be the category that Melania Trump qualified for to come to the US as a supermodel. And there's been constant back and forth about whether she really was an internationally recognized supermodel. It's a very sort of subjective standard. And if you really have good lawyers, you can try and convince them that you're internationally recognized in your field. So that's the first category. The second employment category is professors and business executives. And business executives would be, for example, you have a multinational company and they want to bring over someone from their Japanese office. And then the next category of employment-based is people with advanced degrees. So your PhDs, your masters. And then finally, you get down, and every category as you go down, there are fewer visas available. Finally, you get to skilled workers with professional experience, someone like a sushi chef who doesn't have a college degree, but they're very skilled, or just professionals with an undergraduate degree, accountants with an undergraduate degree, et cetera. And then another category of other, and other is a very broad category. It's kind of the, leftover, throw everything into the mix category for immigration. Religious workers, people who have worked at US embassies overseas for years and we want to reward them. It's just kind of a hodgepodge. So about 140,000 visas are available each year under the employment. And so that's about a third of the amount of visas that were available every year for family-based. And that's the second category. So family-based, employment-based. What's the third category? The third category is refugees and asylees. And here we're talking about people who are outside of their home country and they have a well-founded fear of returning because they fear persecution based on one of 5 factors: based on their race, based on their religion, based on their nationality, based on their political opinion, the political activity they've done, or based on their membership in a particular social group. And that might be an ethnic group, it might be sexual orientation, or any other sort of group that faces, a minority group that faces discrimination and persecution in their home country. So these are people that qualify as refugees, And again, it's not just anyone. It's not people who flee a war because you're not afraid of persecution or dying because of the 5 factors: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a social group. A war, you just might die because there's generalized violence. So you don't qualify if you're afraid of generalized violence. You have to be afraid of persecution for one of these 5 factors. And you have to have been forced out of your country, and you have to be outside the borders of your country. You don't qualify if there was an earthquake and you're fleeing because there's no food, there's no economy, right? It has to be one of these 5 factors. And then there's sort of, for the refugees, you're into 2 categories. You have overseas refugees who are in camps or some sort of a resettlement situation. And the United Nations works with countries and goes through a process of saying, okay, which countries are going to take some of these people? And every year, the president makes a recommendation to Congress, and Congress approves a certain number of how many of these overseas refugees who are in camps. They may be in a camp in the Middle East. They may be in a camp in Bosnia. They may be in a camp in Africa. They're outside their home. They have nowhere to go. They qualify as a refugee. The United Nations works with countries to decide who's going to take these people. And every year, the US takes a certain number. And this is really the author of the book, Call Me American, was outside of his home country of Somalia as a refugee, and applying to go to the US using international agencies to help. And that's really the refugee resettlement system. And that's how he came into the US. The numbers of refugees that the United States take have varied. And in 2016, the United States took 85,000 refugees. But for this year, 2021, one of the final acts of the Trump administration was to set the limit for this year at 15,000. So from 85,000 in 2016 to 15,000 today. Joe Biden has pledged to raise the number of refugees the United States accepts to 125,000. Now that's half of the refugee equation. Sometimes people leave their home country, they qualify as a refugee, but they don't wait in a camp somewhere else. They don't wait in a big refugee camp run by the UN. Instead, they flee their home country and they just make their way to the US and they show up. And when they arrive in the US, they say, I want political asylum. And Congress has provided in the law that anyone who arrives in the US who makes a claim that I want political asylum and who qualifies as a refugee outside of their home country, well-founded fear of being persecuted if sent back on one of these 5 factors: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a social group. The law says if you can prove that your case, you get to stay in the US. And there's no numerical cap, unlike the overseas refugee resettlement, where the president makes a recommendation every year. How many are we going to take in the US? There's always the argument that the United States should be a leader, that the United States should set an example, that no other nation is going to take these refugees and resettle them if the United States doesn't do so. On the other hand, the Trump administration took the position they wanted to reduce the number of refugees coming into our country every year. Unlike that situation, people who actually make their way to US soil can make a claim if they can prove it in front of an immigration judge. They can stay in the US permanently, and there is no numerical cap. But one of the things that's been happening under the Trump administration is that the Trump administration took various steps to try and prevent people, discourage people from making claims in the US for political asylum. One was the family separation policy. The idea was if you knew if you came to the United States and you made a claim for political asylum, if you knew that your kids would be taken away from you, then you wouldn't even come and do that. Another example is that under the Trump administration, for the first time, people who came to the United States and made a claim for political asylum would actually be forced to wait in Mexico until their case came up. Rather than, as was the previous, they could be released in the US until their case came up, and then they would come back to court and make their arguments. Political asylum in 2018, there were about 38,000 to 39,000 in 2018 cases granted. So we're not talking about a huge amount, but a significant amount in 2018. We don't have numbers for more recent years. But there's an incredible backlog of political asylum cases. We have a limited number of immigration judges, and especially there's always been a backlog, a wait, because there's not enough judges to hear the cases. But with the COVID pandemic and sort of the Trump administration dragging its feet, the wait has grown and grown, and is estimated now that there are over 360,000 political asylum cases pending in the immigration courts. And the average time that these people have to wait for a hearing in front of a judge is between 2 and 4 years. So that is our political asylum and refugee system. So again, the first category of legal immigrants, family-based, and 480,000 visas available a year. That is the largest percentage of legal immigrants every year. Demand far exceeds supply, so there are backlogs and waits. The second category of legal immigration, employment-based, very much geared towards internationally recognized scientists and artists and professors and business people and people with graduate degrees, and relatively few visas available for people who just have a college degree or some specialized job skill. And then the third category, refugees who are outside the US in camps, and the US takes some every year, and political asylees who make their way to the US and then make their claim. And then we have our fourth and final category, the lottery. It was decided many years ago, in the 1980s, that we should have a lottery. And so 50,000 visas a year are awarded based on a lottery system. People just apply and they're pulled out like Powerball. Now, it's limited and there's a complicated formula. And the idea is that the lottery visas are available for immigrants who would come to the US from a country that right now sends relatively few to the US. So the idea is that family-based, really gives an advantage to people from Latin America, because there are already so many recent immigrants, and it's the recent immigrants who now are bringing over family members, and that there are some countries, Africa, the Eastern Europe, where historically there aren't as many recent immigrants, and so the lottery is designed to be available for those parts of the world. 50,000 visas a year, entirely based on luck, who gets in. I mean, you have to qualify, and usually that means a high school education, no criminal record, and there's screening, filtering mechanisms, but really comes down to luck. If you add all that up, it's about 1 million people a year potentially come to the US through legal methods. And under the Trump administration, they took efforts to really reduce that. And so the law provides for up to about 1 million, but the Trump administration, through various efforts, brought that number down significantly. What's the takeaway from this? The takeaway from the current system is that if you don't have a family member, a close family member in the US. Remember, cousins, uncles don't count. We're talking really close family member. If you don't have a close family member who's a United States citizen, and you don't have a college degree or some specialized job skill, there really isn't a legal way to come to the US. So someone with just a high school education who just wants to work hard, the kind of person that, for many of us, that was our grandparents or great grandparents. There really is no line for them to stand in and wait. People say, everyone should wait in line and wait their turn. Well, if you don't have a family member who's a close family member who's a US citizen, and you're an unskilled worker, there is no line. And so the question is, well, what are they going to do? Are these people who want to come to the US and want to work, and there are plenty of employers in the hospitality industry, restaurant, hotel, in the landscaping industry, right? In the childcare industry. There are plenty of employers who want to hire these people in the US. Well, of course, they're going to come. They're going to come, and they're going to come illegally. And that's really, I think, the issue of illegal immigration is that there's no legal way for these people to come. And so either they don't come at all, or they come illegally, and people are going to come illegally. Now, the debate over immigration is often about numbers. And so in the law, before the Trump administration, we were approaching about 1 million legal immigrants a year among the 4 categories. And some people say that's too many, 1 million or two. Big difference. In Milwaukee to Western Montana, the Empire Builder train. It's wonderful. I recommend it if it's still around. It's beautiful.
And you're frozen right now. Okay.
North Dakota, Montana. It goes through North Dakota, Montana. Long stretches of land, room for 1 million people a year. There's plenty of that. Some people say we should give less weight to family connections, and we should give more weight to people who have skills that maybe would benefit the United States. And there are other nations like Canada that have that sort of a system. They give more weight to the job and employment categories than to family. I understand those arguments, but I think sometimes people forget, if you come to the US for a job, and then you get fired, you don't have a safety net. You don't have anyone to take care of you other than the US government to take care of you, the taxpayer. Whereas if you come to the US through family connections, and then you lose your job, you've got family to take care of you. You've got people to take you in. The US taxpayer is not going to be responsible for taking care of you. And so one of the benefits of family-based immigration is that there's an automatic social safety net of the family that can step in and help these new immigrants. As opposed to if you just rely on job skill, they come here and they don't know anyone. They don't have that safety net. And I think that's an important thing to think about. Is illegal immigration a problem? And I think people really have started to care more about illegal or undocumented immigrants in recent years. And I think partly because they've spread out more geographically. I mean, always historically, there were 5 states that had the bulk of undocumented immigrants, right? Texas, Florida, Illinois, New York, California. And if you didn't live in one of those 5 states, you may not run into an undocumented immigrant. And then over time, and as the economy shifted and jobs were available, they moved to fit the jobs. And so then people in Wisconsin are maybe coming and interacting with an undocumented population. People in Virginia, right? And so as more native-born US citizens find themselves coming into contact with communities where many people are undocumented, all of a sudden they feel like, oh, we're being overrun. How many undocumented immigrants are here? Estimates, I mean, we don't know, but estimates usually fly around the 10 million or so. And are they really hurting our economy? One thing to recognize is I don't care whether you're a legal immigrant or an undocumented immigrant. You're paying taxes. Now, some undocumented immigrants get a taxpayer ID number and they actually file individual income taxes. Some don't, but all undocumented immigrants are paying sales tax. When they purchase a bag of chips, right? They're paying sales tax and they're paying property tax. Even if they're just a renter, a portion of their rent is going to pay the property tax of the building where they live. So they are paying taxes. And so, one thing I like to say is if you look at Miller Park, well, I guess now it's not Miller Park. Was it?
American Family
Field. Well, that was built with sales tax dollars. And so I always say, undocumented immigrants in Milwaukee paid just as much towards that stadium as I did, or you did, because they're buying stuff, right? And collecting sales tax.
Ed,
so
it's
of course.
I'm just asking you right now because what you've been talking about just really struck a chord with me. My great grandparents on both sides were immigrants. One side was Polish and the other side was Bohemian. And they didn't come directly to Wisconsin. They went to Canada and then they ended up in Wisconsin. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, that doesn't maybe sound like it was legal channels. What do you think?
Well, it's very possible. It's very possible. And, a lot of this gets lost in family history where you do have instances where a family member did come to the US without permission. And, under family lore, it gets kind of obscured because, people don't want to admit that. And so no one says, oh, yeah, grandpa came here and he was undocumented. Instead, it's, oh, well, there was he knew someone in the factory and he must have gotten a visa that way. So a lot of this gets obscured. And the fact is,
farming community, Ed, in both cases, farming communities. Yeah. And I guess I just started wondering, people act like this is a new phenomenon that, people who come into this country, it's like a sudden problem. And I'm sitting here thinking, I think that this has been going on for a lot of years. Am I completely wrong? Or is it like quite possible that it's about the same level, just maybe a different country that we're seeing more from?
Well, I think that's it exactly. Is that we didn't really worry. I mean, well, let me walk that back a little bit. Throughout our nation's history, there have been times when you heard complaints about immigrants. And immigrants were changing our country and not changing it for the better, but changing it for the worse. And we have to do something. But, the sort of quote unquote bad immigrants changed. So initially it was, in the early 1800s, maybe it was the Germans. And then by the time you're in the middle 1800s, it's the Irish. And then when you're in the late 1800s, it's the Italians and the Jews. And then when you get to, around World War I in the early 1900s, it's all of Eastern Europe is the problem. And then you have real concerns as well in that time period on the West Coast about the Japanese and the Chinese. And then when you get to the 60s, all of a sudden the concern is, Latin America. So it's always It's ever shifting. And of course, the formerly quote unquote bad immigrants become the good immigrants. And all of a sudden it's like, why can't the Latin Americans assimilate like those good Germans did? And so it's always, we're always concerned about immigration, but we're always shifting our focus. I think one thing that I'd like to get on the table is that people are only undocumented or illegal immigrants if we say they are, right? So let's say we've got 10 million undocumented people. Well, if we legalize them, then they're no longer undocumented, and they can come out of the shadows. They can actually work, not get ripped off for wages, not get put into hazardous work environments because their employer knows they won't complain. Now pay full taxes, not just sales tax and property tax, but also individual income tax. And all these unskilled workers who are coming to the US for these jobs, why not create a visa for unskilled workers? And then they come in and it's legal. They're going to come in one way or the other. They're going to come in without legal channels, or they're going to come in with legal channels. Why not create a legal channel for unskilled workers? And so right there, you've got two components of immigration reform. How can we fix this system, right? And if we have people coming in who are unskilled and they come in without legal rights to be here, and that causes problems, and they're in the shadows, then let's create a legal way for them to come in. And if that happens, and you give amnesty to those who came before, then theoretically in the future, we don't have an illegal immigration problem. We have unskilled workers who come in just like we have family people who come in, just like we have skilled workers who come in, just like we have refugees who come in. So oftentimes, right now the Biden administration is looking at immigration reform. How can we fix this? We've been trying to deal with this since the Clinton administration. Various reform packages that sometimes get very far in Congress and then fall apart, sometimes don't even get started. And usually everyone agrees we should have visas for unskilled workers to prevent additional and new illegal immigrants. But where it starts to fall down is, how do you deal with those who are already here? And then you get in these arguments of amnesty or path to legalization. Those who are in favor who say, look, as long as we're making it lawful for future unskilled people to come, we should have a path to legalization and equality for those who came before. And then other people say, well, that's amnesty, and I don't like that. But now, how can you create a path for future unskilled workers and not deal with those who are already here? So those are two parts of this fight over immigration. And I'm afraid really probably the two hardest parts. And then you'll have people who say, well, what we need to do is abandon the family-based visas and go purely to work visas. It's 2021. Let's focus on the economy and who can help our economy. But as I said, that has its advantages, but at the same time, when you have family-based immigrants, they automatically have a safety net so that the taxpayer doesn't have to step in and help them. They have a place to live. They have someone who can take care of them if they lose their job. So that's another area that's sometimes put forward. And then you get this mix of trading, right? I'll trade you amnesty if you accept getting rid of family-based visas and moving to an employment system. And so, that becomes the bargain. And then the Democrats say, but we want to keep family-based because a lot of Democrats are recent immigrants and they want to have family-based. And the Republicans say, well, if you say amnesty for any undocumented that's already here, then the deal is off. And so that's why it always seems to fall apart.
You're freezing up on us. Is there any chance?
And there's one additional.
Ed, you're freezing up on us. Is there any chance you're losing power? Are you?
I don't think I'm losing. I am plugged in
Okay,
and I have power.
okay,
It could just be a bandwidth issue. Let me
all
check.
right. Someone's streaming Netflix in
Apologize
your
for
house.
freezing.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure the connections were there. Okay, my apologies for interrupting to see if it was plugged in.
As far as I can tell.
You know, one of the things that I didn't hear from you was about
Talking about
student visas. Where does that fit? Where does that all fit in, and how did that change in the last 4 years, or did it change?
Student visa. Well, student visas are an important part of higher education, and are very expensive tuition. Everyone knows that, but everyone also knows that tuition is negotiable nowadays, and I.
You're frozen, Ed. We're at 30 seconds now. I'm sure there are good things being said. We can't hear you.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
All right. Just to repeat to everyone that if you do have a question, the only way to get that out there to us is through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. At least I think it's on everybody's bottom. It might be at the top of some of your screens. But if you can get those questions to us, we'll be able to hopefully get to most of them. Ed, are you back?
I think so. Can you hear me now?
Well,
Can you hear me?
You're a little in and out. I can hear you. Let's give it another try.
Oh, okay.
We're frozen. Still frozen.
For immigration reform, we're in the stage of horse trading. And so in Congress, you have some say, amnesty is a non-starter, but if you are willing to switch the system to more employment-based and less family, then I might support some of your objectives. And the Democrats say, well, you know, my constituency is a lot of recent immigrants, and they want to keep the family-based. And we also want to have amnesty. And so you get this horse trading. I wanted to mention one other aspect of immigration reform, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions and further discussion. And that is the so-called DREAMers, the Deferred Action Childhood Arrival, DACA, commonly referred to as DREAMers. And these are individuals who were brought to the United States by their parents when they were minor children. And so they're not US citizens because they weren't born here. And they were brought across the border illegally. And now they're in their 20s and they want to go to college, or they're in their 30s. They want to get a job and buy a house. And for many of these individuals, they think of themselves as American. They speak English. Many times they don't speak a different language than English. In many cases, they've never been to their country of birth. If you see them on the street, they are indistinguishable from a native-born U.S. citizen of the same age. I mean, they dress the same, they talk the same, they act the same. And they may not even have known that they were not a U.S. citizen until it came time to get a driver's license in high school, or it came time to apply for college. And in filling out the paperwork, their parents finally said, oh, by the way, sorry, you're not a citizen. And there is no mechanism under the law for someone who's already in the US, who is not legally entitled to be here, to transform themselves into a legal resident. There is no way in the law to do that. And so they're sort of trapped. They're trapped in the US, always fearful that they'll get picked up by immigration and deported, limited in their options because they can't qualify for federal financial aid for college. They may not be able to get credit, or if they can, they don't want to buy property in the United States if they might get deported and lose their property. And so we have this group of, it's about 800,000 dreamers, as they're called. And there have been consistent arguments that they should be given away to get legalized. For this group, the median age at which they came to the US, and for those of us statistically challenged, median means half the number is higher and half the number is lower. The median age they were brought to the US is 6 years old. They had nothing to do with that decision. And this is their home. And so under President Obama, because Congress would not do anything, you have to have Congress pass a law to legalize their status, because the current law has no way to do that. President Obama issued an executive order saying, look, we deport all kinds of people. The dreamers are at the end of the line. It's only after we deport all the drug lords and violent criminals, and when we're done deporting all of those people, then we'll get to the dreamers. But realistically, that's never. And so that was DACA program, and litigation ensued and lots of lawsuits. And under Trump rescinded that order. And so all of a sudden now, all of the college students and young adults who thought they had a little stability under the Obama rule lost everything. And now they were concerned, are we going to get deported? And then the courts reinstated the Obama rule, more fighting. And now President Biden has promised, right? He reinstated DACA on his first day, and he's promised to fight for a permanent fix. And that's another important part of immigration reform. And there's a little bit of hostage taking that's gone on. There's a little bit of some of the people who are wanting to lower immigration have said, look, if you accept less immigration in other areas, then we'll give you the dreamers. And on the other side, which is more the Democratic side, they say, look, you're holding the dreamers hostage. We want to fix the dreamers, but we also want to fix the whole system. And so that's just sort of a summary of some of the areas where there's debate going on. So hopefully I've given you an overview of the current law, 4 legal paths to the US, why it's not working, because there is no legal path for people who are unskilled and lack a family connection, but they come anyway. And what does reform in the future look like? Finding a legal path for new unskilled people, dealing with the current undocumented population, unskilled people who came in the past, making them arguably equal to everyone else and bringing them out of the shadows, and dealing with the dreamers. And how do we do that? So that's all I have prepared. And I said I'd talk an hour, and I think it's been an hour. So that's pretty good. I'm not a liar.
You know, someone just asked
And so I'd be happy to,
someone just asked a question about the Dreamers. The question they asked was, Congress had a chance to make the 800,000 Dreamers legal, but they could not agree. Why was that? Instead, it was the presidents that took executive action without consensus. So they were asking, why didn't Congress
why didn't
do
they?
that?
Yeah, why didn't Congress fix it? It seems like if there's, in this whole immigration mess, if there's one thing people of every political party, every political philosophy can agree on, is let's take these 800,000, less than 1/4% have any sort of criminal record. Let's take them and legalize them. You would think that that's the easy, but unfortunately, it becomes the bargaining chip. You know, sometimes when Congress is thinking about legislation, it's the thing that everyone agrees on that becomes the bargaining chip that you use and try to tie it to other things. And so on the Republican side, they tried to tie legalization for the Dreamers to other parts of a package that they knew the Democrats didn't like, right? And with the Democrats, they tried to tie legalization of the Dreamers with other objectives they had that the Republicans said that's too much. And so by tying it to other things, they created a poison pill, is really what happened. And that's a shame, but that's sort of the way Congress works. It's all game playing. It's all game playing. I don't want to sound cynical about our government, but I am cynical about our government.
Well, that answered the question that our attendee had, because it's like, well, why didn't it happen? And it didn't happen because it wasn't just a simple, are we going to do this? It was, and this and this and this, right? Kept tying it to other things.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Another question from Karen. She wanted to know about these immigration judges. That was one of the first things you brought up, was the big backlog. And she wanted to know how immigration judges are appointed and how many are there and why can't more be appointed?
I think that's a really good question. Immigration judges are lawyers who are appointed by the president and the executive branch. They don't require confirmation from the Senate. They're not considered, federal judges that need Senate confirmation and have lifetime jobs. Instead, they get, I think, 7-year appointments, and they're administrative law judges. There's no reason why you can't simply beef up the number of immigration judges. And probably about 4 or 6 years ago, if we had done that, if we had added another 10 or 20,000, we could have caught up so that people weren't waiting so long for their case. Because, let's be honest here, right? If you wait a short period of time, you're far more likely to show up and get a prompt result and either leave or win your case. But if you're waiting 3 years, 4 years, then you get lost. You move, they lose your address, you don't get notice of your hearing. Next thing you know, you're part of this undocumented population, not necessarily because you ran away, but because people move and the government loses where you are. And so it's more likely you'll get lost in the shuffle the longer the delay. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we could have added 10 or 20,000. It would have required Congress to pay for them. You got to pay the salary. Now we're at such a point, the backlog, hundreds of thousands of cases. Now we're at such a point, I don't know how you catch up now. I really don't. You can't hire 100,000. So even if you hired 40 or 50,000, right, it still would take years to catch up at this pace. So we've just sort of allowed the system through neglect we just allowed the system to get almost out of control. To fix it is to spend the money to hire more judges. But even then, it's going to take a long time to dig out of this hole.
Right. Another question someone had, and I don't know if it's fair to ask this of you because you are an expert in U.S. immigration law. They ask, how do other countries, how many people do, it says, how many do other countries allow? They must mean immigrants. So it's like when other countries are allowing
refugees, probably. Yeah, probably refugees, because that's really the touch point. Because in terms of lawful immigration, if you're anywhere in the world and you decide I want to change the country I live, we like to think the United States is going to be your first choice, or maybe Canada. When it comes to refugees, they're fleeing unrest, or they're fleeing for their lives because someone has threatened them, to the country that will take them. So I'm assuming the question is about other countries taking refugees. And Europe has had a mixed record in taking refugees. And here, again, the other nations of the world tend to look to the United States and say, well, you say that we should all take our share, but until the US takes your share, we're not going to do anything. And it was significant when you had a civil war in Syria and large numbers of Syrian refugees go to Europe. And actually Germany stepped up and took hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees. And it caused Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, a real headache politically. But they set a real example in the way the US used to. And when Germany stepped up, then other nations in Europe also stepped up. And I think by and large, it's been a success. I've spent time in Germany in recent years, and there's definitely a culture in Germany of we should be welcoming to refugees. And part of it is related to their reaction to their Nazi past, and they want to show that we are no longer that kind of a country. So some nations, like our European Union friends, have stepped up and increased the number of refugees they've taken. Other nations are far more restrictive than the US. For example, Australia is very restrictive and doesn't take large numbers of refugees. So I think there's always going to be displaced populations. There's always going to be a civil war and political unrest and people ethnic cleansing and people getting forced out of their homes. And it really takes international leadership. Countries need to work together. That's why the United Nations gets involved. It's not fair for one nation, maybe the next door neighbor of a country in civil war. It's not fair for that neighboring country to have to take 1 million refugees and deal with them all by themselves. It's not their fault. It's more fair if that 1 million is split up and sent off to every other country. And when all the countries participate and take responsibility, then the system works better and no one country is overwhelmed. But when all the countries start slamming their doors shut and saying, we won't take these refugees, we're not responsible for them, then that's just shifting the burden onto other nations. And so that's just been a continuing problem. But hopefully the United States will return to its past practice. Wisconsin has a very long history of taking refugees, and in fact, the Hmong population in our state is very large compared to any other state in the country. We have a very large population from Cambodia, Laos, and that started after the Vietnamese War. Vietnam War, and accepting as refugees people who had fought on the side of the U.S. or were being U.S. And it has continued, and I think it's part of the vibrant patchwork of Wisconsin, and the Somali refugee populations in Minnesota, where many of them went at first, and now they've come to Wisconsin, kind of migrating a little south, is another example where a Midwestern state can have refugee groups that get a foothold, small numbers, and then grow and become a vibrant part of the community of our state. And I think that that's a healthy thing, in my opinion.
So differentiate between being an immigrant and being a refugee.
Well, again, we kind of choose who we want on the immigrant side. Okay. And right now, our main focus is people who have a close family relative in the U.S. who's a citizen, or else people who have certain job skills that we want.
Or a supermodel.
Or supermodel who has a really good lawyer. But a refugee, they don't necessarily choose to be in that situation. Right. Something has happened that has forced them from their home. And I've represented people, for example, a union organizer in El Salvador who, starts getting threatening phone messages. We don't like unions. You're a communist. We're going to come and get you. And basically flees for his life and comes to the U.S. and says, don't send me back there or I'll be killed. And a refugee, it can be a group that is displaced from their home country, and they just cross over the border, and there's a large number of them. They're all part of an ethnic group, for example, that's being subjected to persecution. The Rohingya in Myanmar would be an example, all forced out of their homes, large numbers fleeing because of official government persecution. And they cross the border and they're put in camps. And then it says, well, we can't take them back home, so we have to find nations that will accept them for resettlement. And that's a refugee. And then an asylee is one person who says, I don't want to be in this camp. I'm going to go to the U.S. And when they arrive in the U.S., then they make their claim in the immigration courts.
Karen had a follow-up question that she just submitted regarding this topic. She asked if you could talk about the process a refugee goes through to become a naturalized citizen, both in terms of timeline and costs.
Okay. Well, the cost should not be much. Now, there's always, bribes that get demanded by foreign governments and the like. There is a requirement that you get a medical exam and demonstrate you have all your vaccinations, you don't have any communicable diseases, and that can be a cost to the refugee. But by and large, they're working through the United Nations and the State Department. And it's a multi-year process. It usually takes at least a year. And the first part of the process is they ask the refugees, are there any people you know or relatives you have in a foreign country? Because they want to match the refugee with someone they know somewhere. And so they kind of identify people in the refugee camp who have a connection to the US, for example, and they have a relative or a friend or some connection. And they say, okay, well then we're going to put you in the line for the US. And then there's an extensive background check, criminal record check, see if there's any, make sure they're not in the terrorist database. And they go through all of that. And as I said, there's the health exam. And then hopefully they're selected to be in the group that gets sent to the US that year. And once they arrive in the United States, actually the US government does not do that much to help them. It's it's really nonprofits and many religious organizations that provide housing, job training, all kinds of emotional support, help them learn English. It's really nonprofits and religious organizations that are really the backbone of refugee resettlement. And it's one of the really unintended consequences, I guess, of the Trump administration when they drastically lowered the number of refugees that the U.S. would take every year. A lot of these nonprofits had to lay off staff and fire people because they didn't have enough refugees coming in to justify the number of people working at the nonprofit. And so it's actually very difficult for many of these organizations the last few years. They've kind of shrunk along with the number of refugees. So that's a bit of the process.
How about other immigrants besides those that are refugees? The immigrants that that came in for, you know, because they had a special skill or whatever. What does that timeline look like? And is there a significant cost to their immigration process?
For the very top internationally recognized scientists and artists, Nobel Prize winners, Oscar-winning actor and actress, they can actually do the process themselves very cheaply. You know, just here's the form and here's a photocopy of my Nobel Prize. It's very simple. For other professors, business people, people with advanced degrees, actually, they have to have a job waiting for them in the US. And the employer, the person who wants to hire them, has to file the petition asking for the visa. So there's already some company, some employer in the US who wants this person. And usually the employer is paying for the lawyers. And it shouldn't cost the person anything. So it is still a time-consuming process. It can take a long time. Again, as in all of these, what I say, 130,000, 140,000 of these visas a year, they run out. And usually, you know, sometime around October on the employment visas, you start seeing stories in the newspaper about high-tech companies are upset because they've run out of visas for their skilled workers, or, you know, other industries are scrambling to try and find foreign workers because the visas have run out for the year. They have to wait till next year. So there can be a delay, but on the employment side, because they already have to have a job waiting, it doesn't tend to be as bad as the family side. And of course, you have far more applicants on the family side, so far longer lines waiting than you do on the business side.
So back to the refugees, Karen wants to get clarification on what it's like for them to go from visa status to actually becoming citizens. Is that costly? Is that a long process?
Well, they enter the U.S. as a permanent resident alien, and then you start biding your time until you can apply for citizenship, which is usually about 7 years. We have many nonprofit organizations that help recent immigrants study for the citizenship exam. In fact, I was in Green Bay a couple years ago and met with an organization that was helping Somali immigrants, helping them learn English, helping them study for the citizenship exam. And I met with a class, and we talked about the U.S. Constitution. It was very, very heartwarming. Again, you know, this is where the U.S. government brings in someone, but then they're pretty much on their own, and the nonprofit sector really steps up. and helps these individuals. It is sometimes difficult for them to learn English, so they have to find a place that offers English classes. The citizenship exam can be tricky. I asked my students in class, sometimes I'll pull out the citizenship exam and ask them questions from the exam, and you'd be amazed how many US born and raised law students stumble over questions. How many people are in the House of Representatives? I don't. Can you answer that, Denise? I won't put you on.
463.
Yeah. There you go. All right.
How many?
I think you're close, if anything. I think
Was
it was.
I good? Ask me, Senator. I know that one.
Put myself on the spot, but it's about a 7-year process. You're not eligible, and of course, if you commit a crime in the interval, there's disqualifying factors that can cause you to lose your chance. But you just have to wait the time and get English language help and help with the exam.
Ed, I did not do a laundry list of the many organizations that you've dedicated your life to here in Milwaukee, outside of that pesky day job that you have. But I was wondering, would you mind telling the people who are attending here what those organizations are, what your experience with them, or maybe any stories that you have that you'd like to share? And you can pick any ones you want. I'm not going to call you on you missed this one. So.
Well, I've been fortunate to be involved with several nonprofit groups that serve the immigrant population in southeastern Wisconsin, and so a very good friend of mine and former student, Barbara Graham, wanted to open up a nonprofit to help immigrants with their immigration law problems. Bilingual, Spanish, English, because immigration law is a very narrow special, and there aren't that many immigration lawyers, and they're very expensive, and the demand for their service is so high they can charge whatever they want. And so Barb wanted to start a nonprofit, but the problem is these people are not U.S. citizens, so you can't get tax dollars to support the nonprofit. If you're serving U.S. citizens, a food bank or whatever, there's grants, there's different sources of federal funding. But if your clients are non-citizens, you can't get taxpayer-funded help. So it was a real challenge. How do you set this up, and who's going to pay for this? Because the clients can't afford it. And actually, at the time I was on the board of trustees of Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese, and Catholic Charities stepped up and took on this project. And to this day, it's the Catholic Charities Immigration Legal Services. And people don't like paying for lawyers, right? You hold a fundraiser. We're raising money to pay salaries for lawyers. People don't want to write those checks. So it really was a fantastic fit to have the church take this mission. And it's been very successful. I'm no longer associated with it, but I think it's an example both of the challenges of trying to form an organization to serve the community of immigrants, but also a real success story. It can be done. So.
Do you have any favorite stories or memories from that period of time in terms of individuals or families that you dealt with?
Well, I have some very fond memories of Salvadoran clients I had early in my legal career when I was representing them in political asylum cases. And there used to be a flight. This is how old I am. I think it was an Eastern Airlines flight. That tells you how old I am. There
I
used to
don't
be a
think
flight
there was
from
such a thing.
Houston to Washington, D.C. At Eastern Airlines? It existed. It existed. There used to be a flight every day from Houston to Washington, D.C. that was known to be the undocumented immigrant flight, that people would cross the border in Texas and go to Houston and DC under the theory, I'm more likely to get picked up in Texas. They won't be looking for me in Washington. And so I had a client who was from El Salvador, from a very small village, no education. And he had to flee for his life because at that time there was a civil war in El Salvador, and the rebels were threatening his life. They said they were going to come back and kill him and his family. So fled. They made their way to, they got on the airplane, the flight to Washington, D.C., airport, Washington. They come off and, thinking they would not be seen, but they come off the plane and they're dressed as total Salvadoran peasants in sandals and, kind of straw hat, amongst all of the business travelers in suits and, walking around the DC airport. Of course, they stuck out like a sore thumb and were immediately stopped and questioned and put into detention. And so they were a very sweet couple, people, but they had never been in a city in their life, an element in the United States and in Washington, D.C. Not only were they struggling with their legal case, but they were struggling just to know how to survive in a city environment. You get to know people. When you deal with the immigrant community, you get to know people, and it really is. You make great connections with people, and you hope you can help them. The law is not easy, and many times it's hard to win these cases. So oftentimes you do your best, and you can't help them at all. And it turns out that this client and his wife returned to El Salvador voluntarily because it just didn't look like they really could succeed in their legal case. But when you do get those victories, you savor them. When you do win one, you have a special celebration because they're pretty rare.
In Milwaukee, what immigration communities do we have here that you've experienced, that you've seen go through the various nonprofits and organizations that you've been involved with? We mentioned Somali and some Latin American countries.
Yeah, Milwaukee is fascinating. You can go on the south side of Milwaukee, right? And you've got Kosciuszko Park, named after a Pole from the time the south side was filled with Polish immigrants. And there's a Mexican bodega on that street because it's just Milwaukee is wave after wave of immigrants. And so we saw very heavy German immigrants. We were built by German immigrants. I used to live in a house that literally was built by German immigrants. And plenty of Italians and Poles. And then starting in the early 1900s, you started to see Mexicans coming. The train line from Mexico to Chicago, it went straight up through Texas, straight up to Chicago. And beginning with the Mexican Civil War, and then following in years after, that was a very easy transport route. And then once you're in Chicago, you just jump up to Milwaukee. What I see now recently is fewer Mexicans coming, more Central and South American,
We lost your audio. You're frozen and we lost your audio.
sorry.
Okay, I can hear you.
Now I'm back.
Yes, you're back.
Okay, I apologize for my unstable internet connection, which my computer tells me I have. Yeah, so we've gone from sort of the traditional first German and then maybe Mexican and Italian to more recently it's not Mexican, it's Central American and South American, a fair number of Peruvians, Guatemalans, Salvadorans, and among, of course, Cambodians, even in the Milwaukee area. I've in recent years a fair number of Muslims have come now. You can tell from the mosque, the Islamic Center is thriving with a huge population, and Indians. So it has become more varied. It has become more varied in recent years.
I have a question from Julie. She wants to know, what are your thoughts on the handling of the 2020 census and how that impacts immigrants, both legal and illegal? Uh-oh, you're frozen.
The Constitution of the United States does not talk very often about citizens. It talks about persons. It doesn't talk so much about citizens. Citizenship is a requirement for holding office, but in most other parts of the Constitution, it refers to persons. And so when you have the census, the common understanding, the traditional understanding, has been that you count every person. And that's important, I guess, socially, because it helps determine the amount of federal dollars and the amount of resources that a given area gets. And so the more people who live there, the more resources you hope they can receive. And unfortunately, like everything in the world today, it's gotten very politicized, and some have argued that the Constitution only allows us to count citizens. I don't think that's correct. But ultimately, if the political will is that that's not correct, but I don't get to decide these things. But the understanding in the document is that our government represents all people, not just a segment of the people, all people. And so whether you're undocumented or not, the government represents everyone. I think that's a good thing. And I don't like this idea of slicing the population and saying the government only really represents a part of the population and only really owes an obligation to a part of the population. Because then, what's next after undocumented people, right? Then they say, well, and socialists or communists, and then they exclude another group, and then they exclude another group. I think it's far cleaner and easier to just say everyone is a person, bottom line.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. Professor, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate your expertise and the time that you've given both to lecture us. We kind of feel like we've been in one of your classes now, but then to take that extra time to answer questions is so greatly appreciated. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us and encourage you to check our website. and the Facebook page for other events that are coming up in the next 2.5 weeks. I want to again thank Beth Jaworski of Shorewith Realtors and Northwest Bank for their support of the Toast All City Read, because they are what make this possible. Money makes the world go round. Thank you, everyone, and good night.